1965 is a defining year in my life. 1965 is the year where in France, where I was born, the legislation that was in place since the Napoleon Civil Code started to change. I want to show you the relevance of the Napoleon Civil Code. This is a document which has, for more than 200 years, underpinned most of the legislation in France. And part of it underpins and enshrines the right of men to control women, particularly within the space of marriage and the family. And what changed in 1965 is that, for the first time, a married woman could work, could hold property, or could simply open a bank account without the permission of her husband. In 1965, I wasn't born. I only read about this. But the moment I read about this is forever inscribed in my memory because of how I felt. I thought it was so unfair. I remember thinking about my mother, who would have been about 14 at the time, and how that changed her life opportunities. I remember thinking about my grandmothers, who in 1965 would have been in their 40s, and who never got the opportunities that I've had today. So 1965 really changed my life because I never looked at my bank card in the same way again. And gender inequalities never get so real as to when you realize that the rights you take for granted are all but a generation away. My name is Laure Humbert, and by now I have lived in 4 different European countries. And what I see is the same gender inequalities everywhere. But I did not always see gender inequalities. For a long time, they were completely invisible to me. They were completely invisible to me, for example, when I was in school, and I was called a slut for having a boyfriend. And of course, that's a privilege that was never extended to him. I also remember, and like many young girls, internalizing things such as what not to wear, where not to go, and ultimately what not to be. But what 1965 did for me is that it made all those gender inequalities visible. I never could look at my bank card in the same way. I could never take it for granted again. And when you start seeing what is invisible, you feel compelled to act. When I was reading about 1965, I had just graduated with a degree in mathematics and statistics. And I decided to do something about this. And since that, doing something about gender equality has been ever more present in my life, using the best tool at my disposal, and that is statistics. You see, statistics are power. When you see the numbers, you see the evidence. And when you have the evidence, it's harder for people to turn their head away. And this is what I always say. Statistics are there to make the invisible visible. Take, for example, violence against women. Many people would agree that violence against women, yes, it's bad. But is it really a serious issue? It's only something that's marginal. Is it something as serious as the economy, the financial crisis? Well, maybe not. Well, then add the statistics. The big statistics here is 1 in 3. At least 1 in 3 women will be a victim or has been a victim of gender-based violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3. Stop and think about 3 women you love. 1 in 3. Extrapolate that to the population of the European Union. It's 500 million, but I can do the math for you if you want. This amounts to 80 million women. That is more than the size of the UK, more than the population of the UK. Now that you have those kinds of numbers, it's harder to dismiss the problem of violence against women as just a marginal thing. And so today what I want to do is I want to show you what some statistics are saying about gender equality. But before I do that, I really want to talk about what's going on today, because 2015 is not just any year. 2015 is not that it's exactly 50 years since 1965, although I really like it when the number adds up so nicely. 2015 is a year of momentum at international level. It's a year of stock taking, it's a year of assessing progress, and it's a year of designing the way forward, because three major things are taking place in 2015. First, the UN's Millennium Development Goals are coming to an end, and that is paving the way for a new framework. Second, the Beijing Platform for Action, another UN document, and which is the key document at international level to monitor women's empowerment, is celebrating its 20 years anniversary, and that is prompting many reviews by international organizations. And third, the European Commission's strategy for equality between women and men is also coming to an end. And its successor, if there is one, is going to define the key priority areas for the years to come. So, in 2015, there is quite a lot of visibility for gender equality in some, and only some, policy circles. But the reviews are showing that gender equality is still a very big problem. And for me, this contrasts very much with the public opinion that there is no issue with gender equality, we're nearly there after all. I have been very privileged for the past 4 years of working at international level directly with those documents as a gender statistician. And my job is to measure gender equality. And of course, that means challenging this perception that gender equality is no longer a problem. But there is an added twist to what I do. I am part of the team that developed at EU level what's called the Gender Equality Index. And to explain that in simple terms is taking a lot of statistics and trying to summarize the complexity of gender equality into one single number. To do this and to summarize the complexity of gender equality in the context of the European Union, what is needed is a framework. And the framework of the Gender Equality Index looks at 6 key domains of EU policy. It looks at the domain of work, money, knowledge, time, power, and health. What I'm going to do, before I start showing you what happens if you aggregate that into one single number, is to show you what statistics are relevant within each of those domains and what they tell us about gender equality. Of course, many of you know that if you look at the domain of work, women work less than men. Looking at the numbers, in 2012, 62% of women compared to just 74% of men for the age group 20 to 64 were involved in the labor market. But then, if you take part-time work into account, this decreases to 54% for women, but decreases only to 72% for men. What this is not showing is the extent to which there is segregation in the labor market. Of course, with issues such as the glass ceiling, women not getting promoted, women not being able to get to top positions. It's also not showing the sectoral segregation that is prevalent there, with women and men working in different sectors. But what I want to get to is to think about the consequences that this has. And the domain of money shows this very well, because the consequence of those inequalities is the gender pay gap. And you may have seen this statistic before, the gender pay gap, which is usually calculated on an hourly basis. And this, in 2012, for the EU, was at 16%. But now, if you calculate this on a monthly basis, taking into account part-time work, this jumps to 20%. But the worst thing is, if you actually take the sum of discrimination over a lifetime, if you think about what happens over the life course and look at the gender gap in pensions, this amounts to an absolutely shocking figure of 38% in later life. Things get so much worse as time goes on. If it does, then I wonder how it starts. And for this, I want to show you what happens in the domain of knowledge. Because this is very interesting. Since 2008, there has been a reversal, and women are now more likely to be graduates of universities in the EU. And if you look at the figures, you can see that now 24% of women in the adult population in the EU have a degree compared to just 23% of men. This is not the case when you go to postgraduate level, or certainly not doctoral level, but it's already progress. Of course, this does not extend to segregation again, with different fields of studies for women and men. And that is going to lead to many other inequalities later in the world of employment. So if things start like this, with what is a bit of a more positive picture, what is the reason that we observe so many inequalities? And part of the answer of this probably lies in gender roles. And there is no better way of looking at gender roles than to look at the numbers of how women and men divide their time. It will not come as a surprise if I tell you that women are predominantly responsible for care. Nevertheless, I will show you the numbers. Among workers in 2010, 41% of women were spending 1 hour, just 1 hour or more, caring or educating their children or grandchildren, compared to 25% of men workers. Now, when it comes to housework, it becomes even more unequal. The figures become 77% of women workers doing cooking and housework, 1 hour, just 1 hour or more a day, compared to just 24% of men. What bothers me about those numbers is when I think about how it translates to the reality of the people on the ground. And what it means that it deprives many people of the opportunity to realize themselves. Men to engage with their children and to engage with their role as fathers, but women to also fully realize themselves. And there is no better way to realize yourself than to be able to have the choices to do what you want, or to enter leadership position where you have an opportunity to change things. But this is going to be my next domain, showing you what happens when you go into power and decision making. And here, men are overrepresented in absolutely all areas. If you look at the political sphere, in the EU in 2014, women represented only 27% of ministers and of parliamentarians. The figures get marginally better when it comes to the environment and the media, but just about. In the ministries dealing with the environment, 30% of top administrators only are women, while on the boards of public media broadcasters, this figure is just 31%. And when it comes to the economy, this gets even worse. 20% of women on average sitting on the boards of publicly quoted companies, and 18% on the boards of central banks. What is more relevant than to ensure that the voices of women are represented in all areas of society, in politics, in the environment, in the media, in the economy. But finally, I also want to reflect on the fact that health matters, bodily integrity matters. And in this is also very gendered, because in the EU, what is startling is that women outlive men on average, so in 2012 by about 7 years. But the number of healthy life years is approximately the same. What that means? It means that men die younger, but women get sicker. Of course, not all of this is biological. And gendered behavior have got a lot to do with it, things such as smoking, drinking, engaging in risky behaviors. But the consequences are important. If women get sicker, if the gender gap pension stands at 38%, it puts women in a much more vulnerable situation later in life. And that is a real problem. So statistics make the invisible visible, and if you weren't already convinced that gender equality is not yet a reality, you should be by now. But what I'm going to show you now is what happens when you produce the gender equality index, when you actually aggregate some of those statistics into one single number. And of course, doing a gender equality index is not a very simple thing. And you will see this in a second when I show you what it looks like. This is the formula that there is to calculate the gender equality index. The very good thing about the gender equality index is that to use it, you do not need to understand this formula. All you need to understand is that it gives you a number that lies between 1 and 100, where 100 represents the best situation for all the EU member states and the EU on average. So I will show you what it looks like, what the results of the gender equality looks like. Unfortunately, the results show that in the EU, we're only just above halfway towards gender equality. And that progress between 2005 and 2012 has only been marginal, and that this leaves much room for improvement. So I wanted to think a little bit about what I would want to see in the future. And this is what I would like to see. Steady progress towards gender equality within a reasonable amount of time. Instead, what I will do is what every statistician should never, ever, ever, ever do, and this is to draw a straight line through the results. And if I was to continue this, it would show that at the current rate, we would still be nowhere near gender equality in another 50 years. So, I wasn't there in 1965. I hope to be there in another 50 years in 2065. When I look at these numbers, I think numbers are nothing unless I can relate them back to the people I love. So I think about my mother, and I think about my grandmothers. And I think about the fact that we never had the same opportunities. But you know what, at this point, I also think about my daughter and my son. Because gender equality is about so much more than just a women's issue. What do I wish for them? I wish for them to have the opportunity to realize themselves as human beings, free from gender expectations and discrimination. 1965 was my own moment of realization. And I wish for my children to have such a moment, to be astonished one day to discover that what they take for granted was not part of my reality today. Statistics make the invisible visible. But visibility is nothing without action. And I just want to let you with this thought, this idea that we have a responsibility individually, but also collectively, to make those changes that we wish to see. Thank you.